Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Horror Analysis with me, Drew. How's it going? Today we're going to be talking about the 40s. Stephen King actually calls it a dead time in horror, and it kind of is. He's kind of right. But there was some interesting things going on. Of course, when people think about the 40s, let's just get the elephant out of the room. Elephant in the room out of the way. Most people just think of World War II. And of course, that had a massive impact during the 40s. Duh. So, World War II, 1939 and 1945. I'm not going to go over the intricacies of World War II in any way, shape, or form. You could go back to 37 for when Japan invades China. You can go back to 35. I did a little bit of research before I came in with this today. That's when Italy invaded Morocco, Abyssinia. But for the most part, Germany invades Poland on September 1st, 1939. That precipitates World War II. That's when France and the UK declare war on Germany, beginning the war. The U.S. doesn't enter until December 7th, 1941, when Pearl Harbor is attacked by Japan. So there's a bit of time where America is still making normal movies because they're not in a war state. So 1942 will have 1941 and 1942. We'll even have some horror movies. Notice that this is December 1941, so production on horror movies was probably done prior to Pearl Harbor. Not a lot was being made during the war years. Not one of the famous Phantom of the Operas, Bluebeard with John Carradine, Lady and the Monster, which is the Donovan Brains remake. And then coming back from the war, you get 1945, 1946, etc. You'll be coming in more. We'll talk about movies in a little bit. Of course, the end is in 1945. May 8th is Victory in Europe Day, VE Day. August 15th is VJ Day. The world is affected by World War II. That's a statement that is simplistic as possible. So there wasn't a whole heck of a lot going on during war times. When people are really dying, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to have, fake people, actors, getting slashed up and whatnot. It doesn't work as well. This shouldn't be all that surprising to anybody. One thing I do want to talk about the first thing I want to talk about before going into the other things, books, movies, television, and radio, I didn't talk about in the 50s, but the 50s video was an hour long, so I'm not going to go back and add anything to that because that's ridiculous. But one thing I do want to mention about that I forgot, horror comics. These really picked up in the 50s, and I had a massive effect on horror of today. They had a massive effect on Stephen King, therefore they have a massive effect on horror of today. Stephen King loves the EC comics, and that started in 50. And we're going to talk about EC as well as other horror comics. But horror comics really started going in the 40s. Because they're still kids. I mean, we're talking about comics aimed at children. Not today, where it's more socially acceptable for adults to read comics. But during the time, it was definitely, comics were marketed directly at children. They still are marketed directly at children, considering what the like commercials and advertisements in comics are directed towards kids. Got my boiling water. I made this a while ago, so it's kind of cold now, but that's fine. So horror comics. The first horror comic, The New Adventures of Frankenstein, started in 1940. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow was adapted in 1943 on comic. The first true horror comic, the first out-and-out horror comic, as Wikipedia described it, is Eerie Comics, 1947, and the first continuing series comic, Adventures into the Unknown, was 48. Again, there's that big gap between, these are published in the U.S., of course, that big gap between 1941 and 1946. I mean, Legend of Sleepy Hollow was adapted in that time, but Sleepy Hollow was Washington Irving. It was already sort of a classic at that point. So, adapting it to comic book isn't like trying to make it a horror thing. It's not the deal. This was setting the foundation for horror comics. Eerie Comics in 47 and Adventures into the Unknown. The earlier stuff was setting the basis for the basis, I guess, laying the foundations. The fact that there were, The New Adventures of Frankenstein was essentially a Frankenstein redo, a remake of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley. And as I've mentioned before, it had been done a few times before even that, of course, in the 30s with Boris Karloff, and even earlier than that when Thomas Edison was a producer on one of the earliest movies, and that was also a Frankenstein. He did a version of Frankenstein. So, yeah, the Frankenstein and Sleepy Hollow, of course, were already well-known books and movie figures and whatnot. Plus, Sleepy Hollow was I don't know if there's any adaptations earlier than that of Sleepy Hollow in film. I know the Disney one we're going to talk about later, because it was in 49. And I mentioned earlier that one creeped me out when I was growing up, when I was a little kid and forced to watch it. It doesn't now. It's sort of silly now, but when I was a kid. So let's go on to EC horror. Of course, during the war, World War II, you'd see Dracula's working with the Nazis, and you'd see zombies and Nazis together, and because monsters are generic bad guys, so they'd add monsters into the villains of the war. So now the heroes have to fight not just Nazis, but werewolves as well, or zombies, or vampires, or sea monsters, or whatever. So is that everything from this list? Yep, it is. Okay. EC was the big horror comic producer. They began in 1950. So yeah, they do belong in the last video, but as I said, that was an hour long. And I'm not going to go back and add anything to that video. But 1950s, pretty early in the 50s. We can talk about the 40s. 1950, they were shut down in 1954 by the Comics Code Authority. The big titles in this one were The Haunt of Fear, The Vault of Horror, and Tales from the Crypt. Tales from the Crypt, of course, became, the 90s television show of the same name with the Crypt Keeper. And the Crypt Keeper was in the comics, too. You could do Google searches on them. So in 1954, the Comics Code. The Comics Code was the comic book producers got together and said, we're going to censor ourselves so the government doesn't censor us. There was a congressional hearing in 1953 about juvenile delinquency, and usually happens when those things are discussed. Someone gets blamed. The comics were a prime target. So, as King puts it, the comic books cleaned their own house before Congress could do it for them. They instituted the Comics Code Authority to censor themselves, to censor comic books. Very similar to the Production Code of America in film that we talked about in the 60s when it ended. I didn't even check to see when it began. When did the Production Code begin? Production Code of America. Motion Picture Production Code. It was adopted in 1930. So we'll probably try talking about that next time. Or at least mentioning it. Or I might forget. Knowing me, I'll probably forget. Anyway. So, in 54, the EC stuff got shut down. They couldn't survive. I looked up the guy's name today as well, and I can't remember it. The EC producer, the EC director, what was his name? Gaines, Maxwell Gaines. Maxwell Gaines was the director of EC Comics, and he felt that he was targeted, and basically was, because those three were shut down pretty much instantaneously by the Comics Code Authority, and Mad Magazine became Mad Magazine because it stopped being a comic book. It went from comic to magazine form, and that's how it survived. The only way it survived, and it was comedic as opposed to horrific. Right. Like the production code, most of the guidelines that I read were essentially the same. You could put them side by side. Don't portray authority figures in negative light. Don't portray crime in a positive light. Drugs, sex, alcohol, blah blah, all off the table. You can't touch it. If you didn't get the code, the advertisers wouldn't. The advertisers were really into. They wouldn't advertise on ones without the code. The little sticker that said code approved, like Archie stuff. This is when Archie got big because they were very good at adhering to this code. And Archie seems tame to most of us, but many of us, sorry, Archie fans, seems tame to me. But they adhered to code, so they became very popular because they were easily published and easily advertised in. Alright. Horror comics were good. And we talked about World War II. Of course, that's going to pop up again and again. Because we'll be talking about 1941, 1940, and then we'll be talking about 1946, 7, 8, and 9. And then in England there was nothing from 39 to 45. There was no. Hammer Films didn't release a film from 37 to 48. I think that was it. I think that's what my note says. 38 to 48. Hammer Films did not release a film. They only began in like 35, I think, and they only released one horror film then, quasi-horror, horror crime, with Bela Lugosi, called Haunted or Terror Ship. It was a boat, a murderer on a boat in a storm, who was killing people. And they have one true horror movie in this list back in around 49, which we'll get to when we get to movies. But before that, until the 50s, they weren't really a horror production company. And now horror films, you think, oh, Christopher Lee Dracula, or you think, Christopher Lee Frankenstein. You think Christopher Lee Mummy, and you think, I forgot his name again. This is the second video in which I forgot the guy who played Van Helsing. Who played Van Helsing in the Hammer films? Oh, I still have it in my search engine. Peter Cushing. Of course it is. My apologies. Alright. I know people are going to rage at me. That's fine. Let's go to radio? Radio and TV. Let's do a quick run through of radio and TV. I talked about radio and TV in the 50s and 60s. Lights Out, I mentioned before. It is the Arch Oboler began radio show. From 1934 to 1947, Stephen King, in the 50s, heard reproductions of them because they began... they're in syndication, essentially. I guess syndication is a term for radio as well as television. I don't know. Sorry. Suspense began in 1942 and went to 1962, so that was the longest running radio with horror elements. Dimension X, which is probably most famous, was the 50s. Lights Out became a television show in 1946. So there was horror going on radio. There wasn't big horror radio ever, but some of it was there in the 40s. During the war, I know that Arch Oboler, when I was researching him, did a lot of war propaganda. He even got in trouble for it because he wanted to go further in the propaganda than people wanted. He wanted to have, he wanted to get a lot of hate for the enemies, as opposed to just for the cause. And people saw him as being as bad as the enemy, Axis powers. Nonetheless, we'll jump to television. Not much started in their 40s. Besides Lights Out, began in 46, and there was sporadic. Mystery Playhouse with Boris Karloff was 49. That became Thriller in the 60s. But 49 is essentially in the 50s, and we talked about some of the Boris Karloff stuff. It was available, but not a whole lot. And of course, the medium of television hasn't really reached a lot of viewership. The viewership in the 40s was light. Most of the newsreels, movie theaters still had newsreels because that's where most people got their information from. Now let's see. Books or movies? Books or movies? Coin toss time. Now I'll do movies. So again, we have a big divide between 1940, 1941 stuff Even 42, I mean, there's one major movie that came out in 42, and you can assume that production was done with it in 41 before. December 41 is when the U.S. joined the war. That's December 7th. 7th? I should know it without checking the notes, Drew. For goodness sakes. But they would live in infamy, and Drew forgets it on camera. Great. December 7th, I had it. That was fine. The 40s in horror were light even at the best of times, with the exception of Wolfman. The classic Lon Chaney's Wolfman came out in 41. There was... Let's start with 40. There's a lot of sequels, and we're going to go over the sequels, of course, too, but let's go with 1940. There's a few. There's a lot of weird stuff in here, too, so I'll make a point of saying some of these aren't horror. Some of these are just weird in the Lovecraftian sense. Or in the normal sense, I guess. It's not necessarily scary, but supernatural. There's supernatural stuff going on, or quasi-supernatural stuff going on. So let's start with some of the weird stuff going on. 1940, Rebecca. The book by Daphne du Maurier was adapted by Alfred Hitchcock. And we mentioned before, Alfred Hitchcock and Daphne du Maurier did The Birds in 1960? Yeah, or 1950s. Late 50s, early 60s. So that they teamed up again, or they teamed up previously, in Rebecca, which is a du Maurier book, very famous du Maurier book. House of Seven Gables was adapted to film in 1940, starring Vincent Price. Vincent Price is going to be popping up a lot here, and he should. This is where he's getting his work. He's getting well, we don't know beginning. He began in the 30s. But Black Friday, I don't know anything about it, but I'm just mentioning it because it's on every one of those lists that seem to pop up on IMDb, the best horror movies of the 40s and whatnot. So Black Friday, I should know it probably, but I don't. The sequel to The Mummy, The Mummy's Hand. The sequel to The Invisible Man, surprisingly, is called The Invisible Man Returns. That's also Vincent Price. Vincent Price has a really good voice, so if he's invisible, it still works because he's a great voice. Dr. Cyclops. I have this. Oh, I know why I had this. This had a great... this had a great title or description. Oh yeah, a mad scientist working in South American jungle miniaturizes his colleagues when he feels his megalomania is threatened. That's the IMDb's description of it. That's a precursor to your big bugs. I think the 1950s picked up where Dr. Cyclops left off. Going on to 1941, Spencer Tracy and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Not the most famous one, but definitely a version. King of the Zombies, which is one of my favorite bad movies. Mantan Moreland is the only actor of note that he deserves more credit because he's the person who saves the movie. It's incredibly racist. It's Mantam Moreland is the black valet of the um, hero, and he's scared of everything, but he's the only one that is a decent actor in the thing. And they crash land on a they crash land an army plane on an island, and zombies are around because they're hypnotized by a Nazi collaborator. It's not a Nazi collaborator, it's just a German guy. In 1941, Britain and UK and France were already at war with Germany. So when they say that, and Germany was invading a lot of countries at the time, so when someone was working with the Germans, they're basically a Nazi collaborator. I seem to have thought that this was after a post-World War II movie, and it wasn't. Wolfman with Lon Chaney is 1941, as I mentioned before. Invisible Ghost, another one that everybody mentions. I don't have any idea what it's about. I think that was a Bela Lugosi one from my research, but I don't know. 1942, the only one of note is Cat People, which we mentioned in our discussion of the Fantastic. And we mentioned it in Fission. We should have. It's Were Leopard. King talks about it quite a bit in Dance Macabre, in that it doesn't work for modern audiences because that's a bit much. I'm not going to get into the details of it. For various reasons, it doesn't work for modern audiences. There's a big section of it in King when he talks about radio, and it talks about how our expectations go for movies. This is not a modern movie. We expect certain things from our movies because we're in the modern world. This one doesn't deliver because it couldn't at the time, with technology being what it was. So, King talks about it a lot. King doesn't say anything bad about it, except that it doesn't work for him. It's not that it's a bad movie. It's also obviously one of the most famous ones of the 40s. Fan of the Opera, not one of the famous ones. I don't remember who was in it. John Carradine in Bluebeard was that was 43. So the ones that were made during the war itself were few and far between, obviously, and they tended to be remakes of books. Phantom of the Opera by LaRue. And it seemed to be more crime-oriented from what I read in the description. Bluebeard, John Carradine, a painter killing his models. Lady and the Monster was also 1944, along with Bluebeard. That was a Donovan's Brain. Come on now, Drew. I'm proofreading my notes, and they're notes, so I don't know why I'm doing that. Lady and the Monster was a Donovan's Brain remake. Donovan's Brain we talked about in Overreacher. It's about a guy who keeps a brain in a vat of chemicals alive, and the brain communicates with him telepathically and tells him to go hurt people. So, Lady and the Monster is a version of that. 45, we're going to start, post-war. We're going to start going back into things. Picture of Dorian Gray. It's the Angela Lansbury version. It's the most famous version of Picture of Dorian Gray. The Body Snatcher, which was a takeoff of a Stevenson story that had both Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff in it. That's one that's sort of like a shock horror, or tried to go for as shock horror as you could at the time. Other than that, there's the weird quasi horror, and then there were none. Agatha Christie. It's creepy. It creeped me out as a kid, but I was scared of everything as a kid. but it's not horror, it's mystery. But it's suspenseful. It's good suspense. Beast with Five Fingers, hand strangles people. Well, that was 1946. She-Wolf of London, famous as well, also 1946. 1947, you have, not really horror as such, but The Ghost and Mrs. Moore. I don't think I have anything for 48. In 1949, Disney released The Adventures of Toad and The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, which was two shorts. One was a Sleepy Hollow and one was Wind in the Willows. The Sleepy Hollow one was The Legend of Sleepy Hollow in Disney cartoon form. It creeped me out as a kid, as I mentioned a few times. And 1949's the second attempt of horror from the Hammer production company. They started back up in 1948, did a lot of detective stuff. They did a lot of detective stuff up until the mid-50s, and then they went pretty much full throttle horror. Man in Black was the title of the second Hammer horror film. It was a weird description. That had a weird description too. It was a man suspects his new wife is trying to drive his daughter insane, so she wouldn't inherit the money. So what does he do? He fakes his own death by using yoga to make himself look like he's dead, so he could spy on her. I got nothing. I have no idea what that's. I guess it makes sense in 1949. Yoga to fake your own death. In 2013, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Right. So as I said, it's quite light on horror movies. The war was the focus in the 40s for everybody. In horror comics, they might have some, release comics with horror monsters collaborating with the enemy. Other than that, not much was going on during the 40s at all. Not during the war years at all. Is that right? Is that what I had in my notes? Yeah. Besides maybe a few classics. Bluebeard, of course, is a classic too. It's not like it was turned into a play a few times, I think. Opera. It was turned into an opera. That's what it was. But it's about a serial killer, and it's based on a real life mass murderer, not a serial killer. Well, no, not a mass murderer either. I don't know. Bluebeard is Gil de Rais? Is that one? Charles? No, Gil de Rais, I think, is Bluebeard. One of the things I didn't like about the Somtow's horror books, vampire books, is he kept meeting famous people. Gil de Rais was one of them. I thought that was really bad. So during the war, Phantom of the Opera, Bluebeard, and Lady and the Monster, which is a Donovan's Brain, and a remake of an earlier Donovan's Brain, I think. And then basically that was it for the war years, and then some horror comics. During the war in novels, nothing. I'm not finding anything besides, pre Pearl Harbor 1941 or post VJ Day 1945. For the early stuff, there wasn't a lot going on. The earliest part, the pre-war, there was very, very little writing going on in the horror field, besides pulps. And that was dying off too. At this point, in the 30s, Robert E. Howard died, and H.P. Lovecraft died. So that generation is done by now. The new generation isn't started yet. It's going to start at the end of the decade, but in the beginning of the decade, we're just codifying the old generation. And we're going to go to August Derleth. August Derleth was a writer, and he wrote quite a lot of stuff. But he wrote, well, he's most famous for not writing. He's most famous for founding Arkham House. Arkham House is where you go for Lovecraft. He basically got all the Lovecraft stuff together and started publishing it. He got the fragments that Lovecraft never finished, and sort of worked them into his own, wrote them posthumously. Oh my god, that word. After death, he collaborated with him. A lot of Lovecraftian stuff. But even he didn't write during the war. Someone in the Dark was one of his first ones in 1941. Something Near was 1945, and Not Long for This World is 1948, and he went on in the 50s as well. He founded Arkham House in 1939, and a lot of Lovecraft mythos authors, and there's a lot of them, Robert Howard as well, of that style, of that, the mythos style. Actually, I think he's the one that was credited for quoting Lovecraft mythos, or mythos. So he's very Lovecraftian, and he's setting the stage for Lovecraftian now. Arkham House is still publishing today, and if Lovecraftian stuff, I'm not sure how Lovecraftian their modern stuff is, but we'll see. Most of the other stuff, I have three other authors to talk about. So not a whole lot going on in the 40s. And these are the very late 40s as well. Robert Bloch started in the 40s, went on in the 50s. Of course, he wrote Psycho in the 50s and was made into a movie in the 60s. And I think he died in the 70s? Or did he die in the 90s? He wrote lots. He kept writing forever. No, he died in the 90s. I'm getting all confused. I don't have it down in my notes. But for his first stuff, we're in the late 40s. He started off in Lovecraftian style too. The opener of The Way was a Lovecraftian collection. That's 1945. 1947, you have his first novel, The Scarf. And then another collection in 1945 was Sea Kissed, of horror-ish tales. Of course, he's most famous for Psycho and doing crimey stuff afterwards. He did quite a bit of stuff afterwards. I think I have a Jekyll and Hyde type book by him. I don't think I've read it yet. Put it on my list. I have a lot of books on my list. Ray Bradbury, another type from that era, released Dark Carnival in '47, where he had quite a bit of short stories, including quite a few that were turned into movies as well, and a lot of them were horror, fantasy, that sort of stuff. That's Bradbury's style. The new one I want to talk about, and of course I've mentioned her several times, Shirley Jackson started in the '40s. And if anybody wanted to put a short story that was the best horror short story of the '40s, they'd probably put The Lottery down. I wouldn't be surprised at all. Maybe something from Dark Carnival might beat it out. I doubt anything from Arkham House would. But she had only 2 books in the '40s. Lottery and Other Stories, which is a collection, of course, obviously, and The Road Through the Wall, which was a non-supernatural drama type stuff with uncomfortable elements, I want to say. People being vicious and cruel, and that kind of comes up against horror, but isn't really horror. But a lot of Shirley Jackson stuff is, she's kind of instrumental in bringing horror to us. You don't have to go to Castle in Transylvania to get horror. Horror is on your street. Even The Lottery, it's until The Lottery happens, it seems like a normal street in a normal town. And of course, The Lottery is the basis of Stephen King's definition of monster. It's the most formal, or the monster, the outsider is formally, I forget the exact quote. The monster is symbolized only by having a black dot on a piece of paper. That's how outsiderhood is determined. And your the outsider, the concept of the outsider, is Stephen King's basis for monster. Or not monster, but his basis for horror is the Tales of the Hook. Is the outsider get him or the outsider run? That's the simplest horror tale you have. Those are your 2 choices. It's like the outsider get him, everybody go and kill the outsider. Mob, get a mob to kill the outsider. Or outsider run, the outsider's coming for me. I don't have a mob of people with me, I gotta run. Or die. But Shirley Jackson, in both the books, I read a synopsis on the other one. Even though it's non-supernatural, I wanted to see what was going on. And even in her later books, she's not talking about old ruined houses. She's talking about normal houses. Even the Hill House was, maybe eccentric on the outside, but it wasn't dilapidated. Because people could stay in there for the night. They just didn't make it through the whole night. And of course, that sort of idea um, was very instrumental in what we have today. Like, without, if Stephen King were writing stories about castles in Transylvania or ruined, the ruined house at the end of in the middle of nowhere, where bad stuff happened, or at the Mountains of Madness from the South Pole in the middle of mountains, or whatever. There's only so many exotic locales you can get to, and then you don't feel the connection. The audience doesn't feel the connection as much. If you put it in generic hometown USA, like Shirley Jackson often does, there's a huge connection there, and it hits harder, hits closer to home. Even Dracula, where Dracula comes to London, it's Transylvania comes to London, sort of. You can see it that way. I'm not saying that she's the first person to do this either, but it's the first person to make it work well. Yeah. Well, I don't know if I'm overstepping there, but it's possible. Okay, so books, movies, TV, radio, comics. Yeah. Next time, we're going to talk about the 30s. This time I was working without a net. I didn't have Stephen King backing me up, because he ended in 1950. He began in 1950. Since we're going backwards, he ended in 1950. We don't have Lovecraft backing us up yet, because this was published in 1927. What we have is nothing until I get through the 30s. 30s will pick up more, because we have the Universal Monsters, not just the sequels to them, with the exception of Wolfman, which was 1941. And of course there was, I'll mention this, during the 40s there was lots and lots of horror comedies. There was and lots of sequels. There's about 4 sequels to The Mummy. There was Frankenstein sequels, The Wolfman Meets Frankenstein, etc., etc., etc. Frankenstein. There was even like Frankenstein, Dracula, the Wolfman, and the Invisible Man all meet at Castle Dracula or Castle Frankenstein, or one of those two. Actually, probably both, because I think there was 2 movies that was mentioned in there. And I was like, I was sort of getting to comedy, and then you throw Abbott and Costello in, and there was Abbott and Costello meet Dracula, Wolfman, Frankenstein, Invisible Man, the Murderer, Jack the Ripper, blah 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 blah. Lots and lots of comedies, and all of them. Stephen King goes after all of them. He doesn't like to see his monsters be made fools of. The monsters that he likes, that he appreciates. He doesn't want to see them turn into jokes. And it's an obvious, I can see his point. And then, even later, the Three Stooges, at the end of the 40s, beginning of the 50s, the Three Stooges were making fun of, Dracula, Frankenstein, etc., etc. Ghosts, lots of ghosts. So there's a lot of horror comedies going in there. And during wartime, you'd expect that. During wartime, during the 40s, during the 41 to 45, there were some of those in there. Because during wartime, people like to laugh. They already have enough to be scared of. Like their son or daughter not coming home, or son rather, in the 40s. It's their son not coming home, or their husband not coming home, or their boyfriend not coming home, etc., etc. Our cousins, brothers, expand out ad infinitum. So yeah, there wasn't a lot of horror movies going on during that time. A lot of comedies. So if you could laugh at stuff that scares you, that was appreciated. That's why you have and Enter Abbott and Costello Meet the Wolfman. Follow? All good? All gravy? This didn't seem like a long video, but I've been going for 50 minutes here, so I'm going to wrap it up. Next time I'll go back to the 30s. Back to the future. No. Back to the 30s. And then I get to stop working with Annette, and I can finally get into supernatural horror and literature. Awesome. I'm looking forward to that as well. Cool. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for watching Horror Analysis. I will see you next time. Kids, I mean, we're talking about comics aimed at children. Not today, where it's more socially acceptable for adults to read comics. But during the time, it was definitely, comics were marketed directly at children. They still are marketed directly at children, considering what the like commercials and advertisements in comics are directed towards kids. Got my boiling water. I made this a while ago, so it's kind of cold now, but that's fine. So horror comics. The first horror comic, The New Adventures of Frankenstein, started in 1940. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow was adapted in 1943 on comic. The first true horror comic, the first out-and-out horror comic, as Wikipedia described it, is Eerie Comics, 1947, and the first continuing series comic, Adventures into the Unknown, was 48. Again, there's that big gap between, you know. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Horror Analysis with me, Drew. How's it going? Today we're going to be talking about the 40s. Yeah, Stephen King actually calls it a dead time in horror, and it kind of is. He's kind of right. But there was some interesting things going on. Of course, when people think about the 40s, let's just get the elephant in the room out of the way. Most people just think of World War II. And of course, that had a massive impact during the 40s. Duh. So, World War II, 1939 and 1945. I'm not going to go over the intricacies of World War II in any way, shape, or form. You could go back to 37 for when Japan invades China. You can go back to 35. I did a little bit of research before I came in with this today. That's when Italy invaded Morocco, Abyssinia. But for the most part, Germany invades Poland on September 1st, 1939. That precipitates World War II. Is affected by World War II. That's a statement that is simplistic as possible. So there wasn't a whole heck of a lot going on during war times. When people are really dying, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to have, fake people, actors, getting slashed up and whatnot. It doesn't work as well. This shouldn't be all that surprising to anybody. One thing I do want to talk about the first thing I want to talk about before going into the other things, books, movies, television, and radio, I didn't talk about in the 50s, but the 50s video was an hour long, so I'm not going to go back and add anything to that because that's ridiculous. But one thing I do want to mention about that I forgot, horror comics. These really picked up in the 50s, and I had a massive effect on horror of today. They had a massive effect on Stephen King, therefore they have a massive effect on horror of today. Stephen King loves the EC comics, and that started in 50. And we're going to talk about EC as well as other horror comics. But horror comics really started going in the 40s. Because they're still... That's when France and the UK declare war on Germany, beginning the war. The U.S. doesn't enter until December 7th, 1941, when Pearl Harbor is attacked by Japan. So there's a bit of time where America is still making normal movies because they're not in a war state. So 1942 we'll have 1941 and 1942. We'll even have some horror movies. Notice that this is December 1941. So production on horror movies was probably done prior to Pearl Harbor. Not a lot was being made during the war years. Not one of the famous Phantom of the Operas. Bluebeard with John Carradine, Lady and the Monster, which is the Donovan Brains remake. And then coming back from the war, we get 1945, 1946, etc. You'll be coming in more. We'll talk about movies in a little bit. Of course, the end is in 1945. May 8th is Victory in Europe Day, VE Day. August 15th is VJ Day. The world... These are published in the U.S., of course. That big gap between 1941 and 1946. I mean, Legend of Sleepy Hollow was adapted in that time, but Sleepy Hollow was Washington Irving. It was already a sort of a classic at that point. So, adapting it to comic book isn't like trying to make it a horror thing. It's not the deal. This was setting the foundation for horror comics. Eerie Comics in 47 and Adventures into the Unknown. The earlier stuff was setting the basis for the basis, I guess, laying the foundations. The fact that there were, the New Adventures of Frankenstein was essentially a Frankenstein redo, a remake of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley. And as I've mentioned before, it had been done a few times before even that, of course, in the 30s with Boris Karloff, and even earlier than that when Thomas Edison was a producer on one of the earliest movies, and that was also a Frankenstein. He did a version of